I just want to give a quick warning before this video starts. This video, along with the following parts, are going to probably be containing serious medical topics, mental illnesses, and disturbing experiments, and also some graphic violence throughout. And there's going to be one or two moments of flashing lights, but I will tell viewers I'll tell you guys when that comes up. But yeah, I just want to say, just watch at your own risk. And also, I will spoil everything, so if you have not seen this movie yet on YouTube, go ahead and watch it. It's free. And one last thing I'm going to be saying is, the way I'm going to be presenting these videos is, so as you could probably tell from this title, I'm going to be telling, Chapter 1, Chapter 2, as well as the very opening of the film for this part. And then next time I cover this, I will be covering Chapters 3 and 4, then followed by 5 and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, because it's a 10-chapter movie for some reason. And then the last part is going to be the full timeline after we've gone over everything. And then there might be one mega video at the end where I piece everything together. Also, at the end of this video, so I'm going to be going over everything in these chapters. And then at the very end of this video, I'm going to be recapping over what Chapter 1, Chapter 2 means of all the stuff that we have presented, if that makes sense. And so then at the very final analysis, we'll piece all those recaps and everything together and see if we can make a story out of it. So if you're not a faint of heart, I would recommend do not watch this video or, the explanation or even the actual movie unless you're up for it. And if you want to skip all the recaps and get right into the final timeline, you are probably going to have to wait for quite a while. So without further ado, let's dive into the twisted alternative world of Emesis Blue. We start the film with the Fortress Films logo, and we then hear the FNAF starting screen sound effect for some reason, and are put into a staticky presentation led by Helix Technologies. The presentation shows what appears to be a wide chamber. The official screenplay describes it as a cube-shaped machine with a single sliding door. The title of the presentation comes on screen, being called The Respawn Machine. Also, something interesting to note is the copyright date appears to be a series of letters. Many will associate this with Roman numerals, and that looked to be the case. But I also had the feeling it was another code of some kind, so just to make sure, I wanted to look up what this meant in Roman numerals, and these letters translate to number 1964. And since we will see later that this film takes place in 1968, it's shown that either the company started in 1964, but most likely, they probably existed before then, and it's just saying that the Respawn Machine presentation was made in 1964. Adding to this evidence is the do not redistribute sign under the date, meaning that this is, in fact, private information for good reason. After this text disappears, we see the title, Trial Number 001, in the top left corner, and the door opens, revealing a man. It's to be noted that this film is in the Team Fortress 2 world, and the 9 mercenaries are used as most of the models in this film. However, this first man does not look that much like any of the 9 mercenaries. It could be Scout, Spy, or even Pyro maybe, just a little disfigured. We don't hear any noise or words from the man, but we do get some text from him saying, "It's eternity in there." Remember this quote for later on. The man then falls to his knees, and we're going to have to assume that he's dead. The camera skips to trial number 002, and this time someone with soldier silhouette comes out and, just like before, doesn't make any noise, but instead has text. And all he says is, "My eyes hurt." We then get a 1-second close-up of Soldier's eyes, but there are 2 problems. 1, his eyes don't only hurt, they're actually missing, and 2, this isn't Soldier. This appears to be an entirely different man. Just as before, the camera skips to trial number 003, and just like last time, it's a Soldier silhouette. Also, by the way, with that second trial guy, we will get to him later, just letting you know. What's different about this third Soldier silhouette from trial number 003 is that there's no noise or text, just violent shaking. Instead of skipping to trial number 004, we get smooth static transition this time. That's not important, but still a cool effect. Now we are at trial number 004, and this one disturbs me the most, is instead of the door opening to reveal another subject, this time we actually hear something. We hear a rumbling that appears to be getting louder and louder until the screen lights up to reveal blood all over the door, floor, and the right wall for some reason. The official screenplay describes this as something pounding the door from the other side. Right before cutting away from the scene, we have a blink and you'll miss a picture of what appears to be a red door or something similar. We are now presented the film's title, Emesis Blue. Oddly enough, there's a black and white picture of Medic and Scout with their eyes blacked out, almost like an unnerved anime villain. The title fades out with both men disappearing, but Scout seems to get wiped away faster than Medic's picture. I mention this because of something that happens way later on in the film. Now, onto the prologue. Some text comes onto the screen revealing the date is Thursday on Halloween night of 1968, and the time is 7:57 in the evening. We hear what sounds like a train rushing nearby in the background, or maybe it's just a washing machine late at night. I don't know, you never know. The text disappears and we are being brought downstairs being led by a blue light. We see a door to an office at the end of the hall where the blue light is coming from, being titled Medical. Also, the score for this scene portrays a feeling of surrealness, like something isn't right, or it could be the same feeling if you are alone in your house and you suddenly hear a knock at the door. We now have a gaze inside the medic's office, and we see his desk is littered with documents and prescription pills. He seems to be having some sort of nightmare. Before focusing on the medic, however, who we will learn his name is Fritz Ludwig, so to make it easier I'll just refer to him as Fritz, we see a newspaper on his desk. Most of it is impossible to read due to the small print and some objects in the way, but what I can make out of the headlines it reads, Red Munitions Plant Raided, Who's to Blame? We get a close-up of Fritz and we take a look into his nightmare. First, we see a dump truck backing up. It stops and lifts its tailgate. Out comes several corpses and they fall into a pit of dark blue water that starts to turn a deep red from the blood of the corpses. We look back at Fritz, who is still convulsing. We go back into his head directly after that, this time looking into a waste tunnel, and at the end we see what looks like a cloaked man with a hat and tiny white eyes surrounded by a red light. The tunnel depletes its water and we see that the water was covering a lot of submerged corpses. In a blink and you'll miss it moment, you can see several of the corpses move. This could be a source filmmaker goof, but most likely it was a small hint to a theme of the undead. Also, as I said, I'm using the official screenplay that I found online to help me compare a few things, and in this moment, it mentions that originally the scene was going to be a completely dark tunnel, and then after a short while, the man at the end appears, and a red light turns on, raising all the dead bodies to life, which would have been visible above the water at this point. And so that would also allude to the themes of the undead, but it's not something entirely helpful, but I thought that would be a good fun fact. Right after this tunnel nightmare, we switch to one last nightmare shot, which appears to be a reference to The Shining. The respawn machine is then shown with a red light around the word respawn above the door, illuminating the room. Interestingly, there's a small blue light on the far right side. The door opens and a mountain of blood comes pouring out. Fritz finally wakes up from his nightmare and almost immediately he notices a red light outside his office door. After a few seconds, we can barely see what appears to be a silhouette with a hat and two white eyes. Looks exactly like the guy from the waste tunnel nightmare. He peers into Fritz's office and sees him wide awake staring at him. Suddenly, we can start to hear some sort of gurgling sound as some black tentacles go up the sides of the door. The mysterious man opens Fritz's office door telekinetically and the tentacles are starting to come into the office. Looking at the wall, the man's shadow reveals his mask has a bird beak on the end of it, taking the form of a plague doctor of sorts. The closest name we ever seem to get from this guy is The Undertaker, which is said much later, and in the screenplay he's called the Cloaked Man. Just to make it simpler though, I will just call him The Undertaker whenever he appears. As we pan back to Fritz, we can see an x-ray of what seems to be Soldier. The Undertaker moves closer to Fritz, now having a glitchy appearance, and reaches out to Fritz. It's also interesting to note that the entire office now has a red tint to it. All the items on Fritz's desk appear to be floating, and now we can only see the Undertaker's shadow of a hand reaching for Fritz's face. Fritz is visibly horrified, but everything goes back to normal, and Fritz hears his door creak open and sees Scout, or in this case Jeremy, who we will also see his name much later on. But I played around with this script and I found that Jeremy got really annoying to say after a while, so I will just call him Scout for the rest of this video. He tries to open the door, but there are some cardboard boxes blocking the way. We look back at Fritz, who looks like he has seen a ghost, which he might have actually had. The screenplay mentions a line which says, "sleep paralysis," again, indicating this isn't the first time this sort of thing has happened. That might also be why Fritz for some reason put cardboard boxes right outside his door blocking it. Well, I guess you wouldn't say outside the door, but inside the door. Anyway, you know what I mean. Then you can also hear the sound of a ticking clock, and Fritz looks at that said clock, which shows 8 o'clock. Despite this nightmare going on for just 1.5 minutes in the video, it appears to have lasted 3. Fritz looks away from the clock and back at Scout, and as the first line of dialogue from the movie, Scout tells him, "I know it's late, but you mind if I ask you something?" Fritz nods and Scout asks him a very foreshadowing and ironic question. "Do you ever have bad dreams?" Fritz sighs and gets his glasses off the table and goes to examine Scout. Upon getting his glasses from the table, we see a bigger and clearer look at the newspaper shown earlier. The newspaper is from the Mortem Post, and oddly enough, if you look up Mortem Post on a search engine, you will be redirected to the word post-mortem, which means after death, or autopsy. And seeing Fritz as a medical examiner, that is saying something. And yes, I am aware he canonically lost his medical license according to the TF2 lore, but yet again, you have to realize this is an alternative timeline. On the Mortem Post newspaper, the date says Thursday of October 31st, 19 something. A blue pill is blocking off the last 2 digits, but most likely it is talking about 1968, the time we are in right now. Because if you look just under the pill, you can briefly see what looks like a 6. And also, it can't be a year before or even 7 years before, because we see this is Thursday. And considering there were 3 leap years in the 60s, 1968 is the only day in the 60s where October 31st was a Thursday. Oh, and in case you were wondering, yes, Halloween of 1968 was on an actual Thursday. The Mortem Post has apparently also been making newspapers for over 100 years, and there is a weather report on the top right corner, but it's too blurry to make out. It's probably not important. The headline is "Jules Archibald has been kidnapped," and based on one of the 2 drop heads, which in simpler terms means additional info, it is said that Jules Archibald was the New Mexico governor, and he disappeared a few days before the election. Police are endlessly searching for him and only disappeared last night, being October 30th. He was last seen at his home located in Mortem, where he vanished. Evidence suggests a home intrusion. This article also mentions he is a multimillionaire entrepreneur. The next part is slightly cut off and you need to look at it from just the right angle to actually read it. But the rest of the story goes that Archibald was suspected of financing a conflict going on in the Badlands area. By the way, according to the TF2 wiki, the Badlands is where Man headquarters is. Man headquarters is ran by the 2 brothers, Redman and Blutarch Man, who hate each other's guts, and are the entire reason behind the red versus blue squabble. Guess who owns which side? The rest of Archibald's side story is cut off, but I assume it says officials are disturbed by this, and if Archibald's doesn't return soon, by default the election will be won by the other nominee, who we can barely see the name of, Chad King. By default, as I've said. Chad King is possibly a reference to the director of this film, Chad Payne, and shown that this guy used some Shining references. His last name could be used as a nod to Stephen King. Also regarding the election, most likely it's just a governor re-election. Going to the second drop head, we see a further story into that red munitions plant. However, the title is changed. Instead of saying who is to blame, instead says it's Blue to blame. Very interesting how the title changes within this time span. Possibly a time jump? But anyway, the story says that the industrial giant Reliable Excavation and Demolition discovered a break-in in one of their facilities. Redmond Mann, the CEO and owner of the company, does not state what was stolen, but immediately points the finger at his brother and rival Blutarch Man, who is the owner and CEO of Builders League United. The 2 brothers were then asked if Archibald's kidnapping was related to the break-in in any way. Both brothers did not comment on that matter, which honestly that actually kind of does seem in character for them. The story also confirms that Jules Archibald was a Builders League associate, showing he worked with Blutarch. The only other thing on this newspaper is a picture of Archibald, which by the way is the same model as one of the citizens in TF2. But underneath Archibald's picture is a 3rd drop head that says Manco stock crash, was it sabotage? But this doesn't give us any more information and says go to page 3 to get more info. Well, would you look at that? I think I've been ranting on this dang newspaper for a good 4 or 5 minutes at this point, and we aren't even that far into the actual movie yet. After looking at the newspaper, we cut to the next scene. we are shown a picture of Fritz and Jeremy, showing that they have been friends for a while. Right next to the picture is what looks like a camera. While we look at this picture, we can hear Fritz asking Scout about his situation. And while we do, we cut to a wide shot showing the picture and the camera are on top of a VCR, which is also on top of an old TV, which is showing news footage that Jules Archibald is still missing. Right beside the TV is a huge stack of VHS tapes, all of them being too blurry to make out the names. We get a wider shot showing the TV is on top of some filing cabinets, and Fritz is checking Scout's teeth, who is sitting on top of a stretcher. Scout tells him he was in the bathroom, and when brushing his teeth began falling out. Fritz asks if he might just be worried about something, which Scout says he is. And he asks Fritz a very unnerving question. You ever feel like you're being watched? We get a close-up of Fritz immediately after he hears this question, and we hear some sort of faint thud in the background. Or perhaps it was more of a thunderous noise. But anyways, Fritz glances over to his medical screens, which are located to his left. The screenplay mentions that he saw a glimpse of a shadow moving across the medical screen. Fritz appears unusually surprised by Scout's question and immediately asks what he means by that. Scout tells him when he was going to bed he swore he saw something standing outside of his window. Fritz tells him it was probably someone walking by. Also, Fritz is repeatedly glancing towards the medical screen as he says this. Scout tells him that it isn't the case because he's on the second floor. So how in the world would someone be walking by if Scout was just on the second floor? Fritz is starting to get concerned and asks if he spoke to his mother about this. Scout responds as Mom thinks he's crazy, and Fritz, finding nothing wrong about his teeth, recommends some pills that he takes tonight, which are called Valium. I did some research on these pills that are shown to be called Valium, or another common term, diazepam. Both are the same medication used to treat anxiety, stress, things like that. Peculiarly, they take their form in blue and white pills, which are the same colored pills we saw on Fritz's desk scattered around. Also, funnily enough, I actually covered this exact same medication from another video analysis on my channel, which is when I analyzed some of Meat Canyon's videos. If you want to check that video out, it'll be in the cards above. Scout says he doesn't need to take the pills, but the doctor disagrees. Scout says to him he sounds like his mother and asks for help getting off the stretcher. We then get told in exposition dump that Scout is moving back with his mother and that he was fired from his job working with Blue, most likely the Builders League. His mother was obviously not happy about that, and he says he's going to sue Blue for what they did to him, and Fritz simply tells him, "You wouldn't be the first." Scout now tells him a word of advice that will be very helpful later on. He says, "Doc, if they ever hit you with something, you hit back twice as hard, you hear me?" Fritz ignores this and says he will give him a ride. They are suddenly stopped when they hear a noise behind them. A box of VHS tapes has fallen over somehow. Fritz is obviously confused how the box fell, but Scout finds a cassette tape called M, which is a real film from the 1930s. He steals it when Fritz isn't looking, and as they are walking out the doors, they hear another noise and notices the doors that they just walked out of are suddenly pushed open. Upon looking at the screenplay and also listening to the scene again, you can barely hear some rapid footsteps. Also, another lighting effect shows that Fritz and Scout are in a blue light almost the entire scene, but when the doors burst open, their faces are surrounded by a red light, thanks to the next sign illuminating above the door. The two men turn around, and they leave the building, ending the prologue. Now, before I go on to Chapter 1, let's try to figure out what in the world's happening here. So first off, one thing we need to elaborate on is the blue and red lights. That should be one of the most crucial things that we need to figure out at the moment. Because here's the thing about the red and blue lights. Is the blue lights seem to indicate when it's a calm or realistic state, and then every time something paranormal or something completely out of place happens, then that's the time that it decides, hey, by the way, let's make something creepy happen. Like, that's when the red light comes on. Because I realized that it's a blue light when Medic is in his office alone, but then once the Undertaker comes, a red light suddenly fills the room. Or just like with the exit sign, the entire scene with Fritz and Scout talking is in blue light, but then once something weird paranormal happens with the door, then everything turns red. And so that's my current working theory, just seeing the prologue, what this means. And then another thing that I want to say is that, so it appears that Jules Archibald has been missing for one day, and as shown, he's a big He's a big guy in this election standpoint, so it makes sense why police are coming after him. Yeah, and so, as I said, it's probably just getting reelected as a governor. That honestly does kind of make sense. The one thing that I found kind of interesting is the association. So if you look at it, Jules Archibald says that he's associated with Blutarch, and there was a break-in in one of their facilities, and both Blutarch and Redmond Man don't say anything about it, or well, technically Red I think accused his brother of stealing, but he didn't say what was stolen. And then when they mention Jules Archibald, none of them say anything. Now, considering of how talkative they are way later on, and also considering of how bossy they are in the comics, if I'm remembering correctly, it does not make sense of why they would just say nothing about Jules. Like, I feel like they're kind of covering for him because that does not make sense. Because if you have something stolen, you're going to tell the police about it. Because if you don't tell the police about it, one, they can't help you, and secondly, that shows that you're hiding something, which means whatever was stolen must have been something that was here. It must have been something so important, so top secret that even the police of the town can't know. Now we'll see later on there is a suspicious red briefcase stolen. That might be it. Also, even in the original TF2 game, the briefcase is one of the most important things in the entire game, which I'm pretty sure had nuclear launch codes or something. But anyway, whatever's in the case, that might have been what was stolen. Because for the longest time, when I tried making my Emesis Blue timeline even without these sections I'm making, I always wondered how in the world the briefcase kept going place to place. That would make sense, as someone probably stole it. And anyway, in Chapter 1, we might get some more information on the briefcase. So, that's like, then as I said, Fritz and Scout are good friends, and we'll see some foreshadowing on them a little bit later. But overall, and then we'll even see the thing that Medic saw when he kept glancing at the medical screens later on. But as of right now, that's all I can deduce as far as crucial information for the timeline for the prologue. And now, let's get into Chapter 1. We are shown some text saying Chapter 1, Graveyard Shift. We're now shown a parked blue car and it's raining heavily outside. A blue soldier is inside the car being a lookout. Also, we don't get an official name for soldier in this, but it's assumed to be Jane Doe due to the TF2 lore, and yet that is a name given to someone who doesn't want their identity revealed. But since that is most likely not his canon name, I will just refer to him as Soldier. Soldier looks out of the car and sees a campaign poster for Archibald. Interestingly, there's some small text at the bottom which says, "If you don't vote for him, you ain't blue," and that was quoted by Blutarch. Also shown by the fact that it says it was paid by the Builders League in the bottom right corner, Blutarch is putting in some big money for Jules to win this election. Soldier then glances to what appears to be a man's silhouette out under a street lamp, which seems to have come in from literal thin air. To settle his nerves, Soldier tries smoking a cigarette, which doesn't work, but then he sees a loaded revolver in the glove box and is probably going to use it to threaten this man. Before Soldier can do anything though, his partner, Spy, whose real name is Jax Murnoa, so I'll just call him Jax for the rest of this video, comes up to the car and is confused as to what Soldier is doing with a loaded gun in the car. Jax also mentions that he is here. We'll figure out who he is later on. Soldier looks back to the man who is no longer there, and Jax takes away the gun, worried that he will hurt himself. Perhaps Soldier is mentally unwell at the moment based on that response, or he just is not a trustworthy partner. Jax and Soldier talk to each other if meeting with this guy could be an ambush, with Soldier being hesitant and Jax dismissing the argument. He tells Soldier to wait in the car and looks out for the police. Our next scene takes place in a dark alley where we see a heavy with a black briefcase enter the scene. He looks at his watch, which reads 8:31 p.m., 34 minutes after Fritz's nightmare began the prologue. It appears this Heavy is who Jax was meeting. Speaking of Jax, he is now holding a revolver to the back of the Heavy's head, insulting him in the process. Jax starts getting impatient and asks the Heavy who was the handoff and the employer for the briefcase. Heavy says he doesn't know what he's talking about, and this makes Jax twice as impatient, holding his finger right on the trigger. After suspecting the Heavy of kidnapping Archibald, Jax finally asks about the briefcase of what's inside it, and asks the Heavy to hand it over. In response to this, Heavy gets into a fist fight with Jax and makes him drop his gun. A fun fact for you is the Heavy has a cut line of dialogue. According to the screenplay, when Jax is accusing Heavy of kidnapping Archibald, Heavy actually chuckles and tells Jax, "Things are not as black and white as you think." As they start to fight, Soldier is seen in the car fiddling with the radio until he figures out it's not a radio, but it's a police scanner. An officer reports a 503 at a local cemetery, and the vehicle in question appears to be a black hearse. Upon looking up a 503, there's nothing immediate that comes up, because 50 is a slang term for police, and it was termed that due to a show that ironically came out in 1968 called Hawaii 50, which this could be a reference to that. Why would a cop say this to another cop on a radio? Well, probably to remain undercover or something, or maybe it's just a reference. As far as 03 goes, that can either be associated with the police captain rank or an emergency situation, or a combination of both, meaning the captain was shot and injured or something like that. The other officer listens on the scanner thinking that this is a joke, that someone will get away in a literal hearse. In fact, it's a good joke, because Soldier laughs at it. The other cops hear his laugh, and in a panic, Soldier turns off the scanner. Soldier gets out of the car, and we see an ambulance pass by. That seemingly out of nowhere, another vehicle comes rushing by, only to abruptly stop to a halt and parks a small distance away from Soldier. Upon studying the vehicle, it appears to be a hearse. Soldier takes note of this, considering what he heard on the police scanner. Also, based on one of the shots of Soldier, we can see there's a church a small distance away. That might be a little bit important later. Before Soldier can do anything about the hearse, he hears some grunting coming from the dark alley that Jax went in. He finds the Heavy about to kill Jax, and almost without thinking shoots the Heavy in the heart area, killing him. Jax is angered by this since he was their only lead. He tells Soldier to get the camera out of his car to take pictures of Heavy's body for evidence. As Soldier leaves, Jax tries opening the briefcase, but with no luck. He hears a dinging noise, looks up, and sees it's coming from the hearse that we saw parked earlier, and it's dinging because one of the doors is opened. Someone is outside with Jax. Jax is now alert, but once he processes this, a man hits him on the side of the head and without hesitation puts a gun to Jax's head. We get a view of this man. He looks just like the Undertaker. Soldier is now heading back to Jax with the camera, to which the Undertaker hears his footsteps and runs, taking the briefcase with him. Jax explains that the man took the briefcase, and Soldier snaps a picture of the hearse taking off. Now, this seems to be more of a short chapter than usual, like compared to the prologue and everything. But honestly, like that, so we got us a good bit more of information regarding this whole fiasco of Archibald being kidnapped in the briefcase. So yeah, okay, yeah. So yeah, there's a few things that were here. Like for example, you know, we're finally getting to learn who Jax and Soldier are. That they are probably not cops, but they're wanting to be involved, try to get in on cases, and we'll see later on they try to pose as FBI agents. And so overall, I think the ambulance is probably a reference to Fritz, because you know Fritz probably drives an ambulance, so that might have been him. And as far as the hearse is concerned, it makes me wonder, because they say we're on the lookout for a black hearse, and then like immediately after the cops say that, the hearse just randomly parks, which means that by the time Soldier's on lookout, the hearse is already gone. Like the hearse already leaves the police's sights and just stops randomly. Now, as far as why Soldier did not see the Undertaker come out is a question, but at the same time, this also indicates that the briefcase is definitely important. Now, as far as what the briefcase is always up to question, because we'll get more information about that within the whole, you know, the whole movie. But overall, like, so it means that there has to be something that is so valuable in the briefcase that people are willing to literally kill each other for it. It doesn't seem like Jax knows what's in the briefcase. Like, he doesn't seem to know what they're looking for, just that it's a briefcase. And so this means that there's a handoff to the briefcase that went to the Heavy, so Heavy probably doesn't even know what it is either, since he is very hesitant about the briefcase, but that could also just be that he doesn't want them to have it. It could be a combination of both as well. But still, and it's interesting to say the least, because it doesn't, I think because it doesn't make sense, but there's enough evidence to wrap your head around it. We'll just have to learn more about the briefcase later on. And overall, that's pretty much it. That and the silhouette soldier saw earlier, that could possibly be the 10th mercenary that was shown killed at the very beginning of the movie in the prologue, or well, actually before the prologue. So it could be that, or it could be like a past version of Soldier. But once again, that's something we'll have to learn later on. And as far as the whole billboard, I wanted to point that out as well, is that Jules Archibald's billboard is there, and it says, you know, vote for him or you're not blue. So it shows that it shows that Plutarch is willing to spend a lot of money to make this guy get in office, or at least strike a campaign resolve. But at the same time, he's also the same guy that doesn't say anything regarding his situation with the newspaper the day before, or the day of. Yeah, the day of, sorry. And so it kind of gets a little bit of a hypocrisy sort of situation. Once again, we'll have to learn more about that. Overall, this chapter brought us a few questions, but not enough to really get to a solid conclusion yet, obviously, as we still have 9 more chapters to go. Now, on to chapter 2. I'm sorry if that sounded really disconjointed. I did not really write a script for that, but I just wanted to see what would come out. Screen fades to black again because of the flash from the camera, and now we get some more text which reads Chapter 2, Dinner's Ready. Our first scene is Fritz driving Scout home, and judging by them driving an ambulance, it looks like the same one that could have possibly passed by Soldier earlier. Scout asks him what he means when he told him earlier that he was not the first, and if he was referring to the accident, which is unknown as to what the accident is at the moment. Fritz tells him others have been involved in this accident, and apparently it was something that had to do with the respawn machine. He starts to tell Scout that he saw something happen once on the front lines, and that he went to see what happened, and some people can get stuck inside the respawn machine, but before we get any further information, he decides to defuse the conversation. Fritz drops Scout off at his mother's house, which according to other sources is on Purgatory Street. Scout then has his brief conversation with Fritz.
Thanks for the ride, Doc. You sure you don't want to come in? At least say hi to Ma?
Tell her I did, Scout. I have to get back to the office.
You really gotta get out more often, Doc.
Keep this in mind for later. As Fritz leaves, Scout announces to his mom that he is home, and he was late because he was getting a checkup. Before we cut to the next scene, if you look close enough in the background, you can see a black hearse. Our next scene takes place in Scout's house, and the first thing that's shown is an illuminated clock reading 9 o'clock. About 30 minutes since we saw a clock last, so that being Heavy's wristwatch. We also see what appears to be lasagna or some kind of breaded dish in the oven. Our main focuses of this scene though is a few shots of the TV, which is playing M, that's the tape that Scout stole, which is a 1930s German film, I think I might have mentioned that earlier, and Scout's watching the TV playing with a ball. The film is playing a scene about a little girl telling her friends in German that a man in black is coming. Keep this in mind throughout the rest of Emesis Blue. While Scout is watching the movie, his mom, who's in the kitchen making dinner, is asking how the appointment went, and Scout tells his mother that he thinks Fritz is on something. We also see Scout eat something with soda, and it's confirmed in the screenplay that it was the Valium pill. As Scout continues to watch the movie, the phone rings, and we hear Scout's mother tell him dinner is ready. However, something seems wrong with her voice in this moment, and it's nothing even like before this, it's just this one moment. It kind of sounds like it's an impression or, you know, an impersonation of her voice. Kind of sounds like a little like AI in a way. So Scout picks up the phone, to which we have this encounter.
Hello?
Thanks for the ride, Doc. You sure you don't want to come in? At least say hi to Ma?
What did you... Who is this?
You really gotta get out more often, Doc.
What the is this? Who are you?
Hey, Ma! I'm home!
I'm going to analyze this scene, but I just wanted to see how many of you I could catch off guard just to make sure you're paying attention. I just wanted to show you that. Because, I mean, come on, that's kind of creepy. Obviously, this is Scout's voice from when Fritz dropped him off, but there's so much more in this scene than meets the eye on first watch. After he hangs up the phone, we hear someone whistling the Hall of the Mountain King, and we pan over to see Scout's mom's, soon to be shown to be severed, head peeping around the corner. When we first look at Scout as he is looking towards the kitchen, there's something going on with the chessboard. Now, I don't know if that many people realize this, but the chessboard looks different here than from earlier. It appears to be an 8x8 chessboard, but something to observe is the first time we see it, all the red pieces are up, and there is one blue pawn. I believe it is showing a recreation of the respawn process, because we hear the respawn machine is now faulty and has only a certain possibility of it actually perfecting a clone. This could show all the red pieces are corpses that didn't work, and the blue pawn, Jeremy, aka Scout, being the only one to work, technically. It looks like there might be a second blue piece, but I think that's just the lighting reflecting off of one of the other pieces. Now, let's observe the next scene where all that's left on the board is the blue pawn, 2 rooks, a bishop off on the side, and a king and queen. Now, since I said this was an 8x8 board, I decided to make a diagram for my explanation. You're sadly going to have to wait until the final analysis for me to explain what this all means, because if I go into detail about it right now, it'll take out the fun of explaining everything else in the story for the later chapters. So if you want to see it early, I put in my whole explanation in a comment on a post in the Emesis Blue subreddit, but I'm not telling you which one, because I want you guys to try to look for it. I'm not revealing everything that quick. When we look at the scene of Scout's mom's head, if we look in the oven, it is no longer a lasagna or bread dish, whatever that flat thing was. Instead, it has been replaced with what looks like a big stick of meat, most likely being the same shape as a goat leg out of all things. The type of meat isn't important, obviously, but still, it's a weird fact. After her head drops, we pan over to see Pyro, who will be nicknamed the Butcher for the rest of the film for some reason. So let's call him the Butcher whenever he appears, because this is a cool name, and he is staring at Scout from across the room with an axe in hand. Yet another fun fact, the Butcher wasn't originally supposed to be in this scene according to the screenplay. Originally, it was going to show Scout's mother's head fall, and then it will show, I think, another scene of M being of a large balloon coupled with a set of power lines floating off into the sky. Our next scene shows Fritz parked on the side of the road asleep, but a weird noise wakes him up. If you listen very closely, it sounds like a car speeding off, and originally Fritz would have looked in the rearview mirror seeing the black hearse leaving. Fritz gets out of the vehicle and approaches Scout's house, and he appears to be feeling uneasy. He rings the doorbell, but no one comes to the door. Fritz finds out the door is unlocked and walks into the dark house with the television that's still turned on. As he opens the door and some light from outside comes in, the first thing that caught my eye was that the clock says 9:35. At least, I think that's it. It's kind of blurry. Nevertheless, it seems to be roughly 30 minutes after our last scene. The couch Scout was sitting on is tipped over and the chessboard has fallen with the pieces all over the ground. Fritz begins walking through the house and we are shown a perspective of facing towards the TV, which M is still playing, and now the clock is more clear to view, being 9:40 when I originally thought it was 9:35. There are 2 other things that come up that are of great curiosity. One being that there are both blue and red chess pieces on the ground, and the other being a light on in the hallway with something round laying in the corner. Getting a closer look, we see that round object is Scout's mother's severed head. As Fritz turns the corner trembling in fear, he falls to the ground as he sees a wall at the end of the hallway, illuminated red with the letter M written in blood. We also see Scout's mom's high heels beside her head, and the rest of her body is inside a room beside the M wall, with her feet sticking out. As maniacal laughter is heard coming from the TV, Fritz turns in fear as he hears loud knocking at the door. You can't hear anything because of the film, but it's obvious it's the police. Even the screenplay confirms this, as well as to say Fritz went to prison at one time. We will later hear that these guys are associated with death row, so that does make sense. As Fritz looks towards the door, peculiarly, the layout has changed. Somehow, when Fritz entered, the TV was facing the opposite wall and the couch was in the middle of the room. Now the couch is closer to the door and the TV is facing Fritz. As the banging continues, Fritz's eyes turn a deep red. He is visibly losing consciousness, and now each time he blinks, he is switching from his normal light blue eyes to deep red eyes, and his nose actually starts to bleed. Fritz passes out, hitting his head hard on the countertop. Directly after this happens, we cut to the next scene, which is of Jackson's soldier speeding through the street. As we look in the car, soldiers holding up a picture of the Undertaker inside of what looks like a van or an ambulance, not a hearse. Well, I guess it could be a hearse, but in my opinion, it looks more like a van or an ambulance. Soldier asked Jax if the handoff for the briefcase was an Undertaker, with Jax responding, almost. Basically meaning that this plague doctor Undertaker fellow was the person that Heavy was going to give the briefcase to. The soldier asked Jax about the possibility of what could be in the briefcase, and eventually Jax tells him to stay focused, that they have to find this guy. Soldier gets the bright idea to use the radio to ask about the stolen hearse, with Jax telling him he doesn't transmit but just receives information. But Soldier asks the radio about the stolen hearse anyway, gets an answer that it's at Purgatory Avenue, and this makes Jax a little bit ticked off that Soldier's plan actually worked. Posing as 185, Soldier is greeted by Officer 187, who says they have a visual on a black hearse at Purgatory Avenue, being where Scout's home is. The officer finds a man inside the hearse and asks for him to roll down his window so he can see his face. What follows is mumbling sounds as if one man is holding the other's mouth, making them pass out. Whatever the situation is, it's assumed the cop is either passed out or dead. Wanting to obtain the briefcase, they turn the car around and head to Purgatory Avenue. The screenplay had an extra scene where originally the dispatch was supposed to ask if 187 was okay, with no response, and then another officer would meet at Purgatory. But I can see why they removed that scene, because it isn't really that important to the story. And since we see the cops later at the house anyways, it wouldn't really make sense that you didn't have to include that. Does that make sense? Alright, another fun fact aside, our next scene takes us back to Fritz's situation, and he appears to be surrounded by a void, but illuminated by a blue light. Fritz wakes up and hits his head on something hollow. We also notice that he is moving as if it was one of my crappy stop-motion films, maybe giving the illusion that time is moving so much slower for him. He starts squirming but realizes he can't move, and starts screaming. As we zoom out, we see he is locked in a coffin inside of a church. The coffin is shown to have some yellow lit holes for some reason, and there's a man in black sitting in one of the empty church pews. Fritz wakes up inside his office instead of Scout's house, and looking at the clock, it's roughly 11:58. Fritz puts his hand on his face and tries to calm down, but sees that his hands are stained red with blood. As he starts to react to this confusing realization, two cops are looking down an alleyway with a flashlight looking for someone, or something. They give up and head to Purgatory's distress call. We pan over to see they were at the alley where the Heavy was shot, only to see that the Heavy's body is now missing. Meanwhile, Fritz is washing the blood off his hands and splashes water in his face to calm down. He stares at his reflection in the mirror for a minute, only for his reflection to actually choke him with blood-stained hands. The reflection looks at Fritz with a hatred-filled expression and tries pulling him in, only for Fritz to break his own mirror. While Fritz recovers from the sudden aggression, he hears a knocking on his door. Whoever is on the other side of that door pushes a yellow envelope under the door. Fritz opens his door to try to see who gave him the envelope. Just as expected, he sees no one there. Going back inside, he finds a key inside the envelope. Another small detail I would like to add is that the clock is actually following really close to the real time spent in this movie. It appears to be a minute and a half after the time we saw the clock before, which is roughly the same time spent between those two scenes if you take out that one police conversation. Also in the envelope, it's pictures of Scout sleeping and walking home, showing that the suspicion that Scout said someone was standing outside his second floor window was actually right. Suddenly, Fritz's phone starts to ring. He picks up the phone to be greeted by Scout's voice. Fritz is glad that Scout is alive, only for Scout to ask him a question. Do you ever feel like you're being watched? It's evident that this is obviously Scout's voice from the beginning, and when he says if he feels like he's being watched, we get the perspective of Fritz Sealing, giving us the audience the feeling that we are perhaps being watched. Or, well, actually more Fritz being watched, but still. Right after this one-sided conversation, we hear the real Scout's voice being muffled screaming, and the only line that is easy to make out is it kind of sounds like in this situation they says, "I'm gonna kill you." Fritz stands up demanding whoever this is on the other end of the line to tell him what they did to Scout. The phone goes dead. We now see Fritz's point of view, and we see that he sees a message written in blood above his door saying, Conager Slaughterhouse. And with that, we end chapter 2. Now, what in the heck was this? So, there's a bit more info that I find very fascinating. With one of the things that you probably noticed at this point is I keep mentioning this clock. Like, I keep mentioning the clock has different times on it. And I'm saying that because I think that would be really helpful. Because since it shows the different times throughout the night, we could probably use that to make a fair estimate of the timeline that happens. Because it says it said that I believe when in chapter 1, it said for Heavy it was 8:34 when he was waiting in the alley. And so then later on, it's about 9 o'clock, or roughly 9 o'clock I think is what it was, wasn't it? Yeah, when Scout was at home, so that's 30 minutes after the hearse leaves. So therefore, the hearse that the Undertaker's in took 30 minutes to get to Scout's house. So either this means that Scout's house is way far down from the alley, but most likely it said the hearse was going somewhere else first and then got Scout's house. But still, we need more information as to how Scout's involved with this. And then later on, we see that at about 9:45, I think is what it was, Fritz came to Scout's house, which that means that Fritz must have been sleeping in his car for about a rough 20-25 minutes for some reason. And then it's 11:58, which that's roughly like 3 hours and 15, wait a minute, no, like 2 hours and 15 minutes, I believe. And so that really begs the question that once Fritz gets knocked out in Scout's house, how in the world did he get back to his house in 2 hours? And it's possible, but how and why? And so that right there is something that I really look forward to as we go down these chapters. See if there's any clocks change or anything makes any more sense than it does now. So one other thing, what's the other thing I was going to mention? Hold on. Oh yeah. So regarding Scout's mother situation interests me quite a bit. Because this shows, like, you know, since the butcher is in here, and most likely the Undertaker is the one that actually killed her in the kitchen. This kind of means, so one thing I didn't mention is that, you know, Scout takes the Valium. I said that, but something that you might realize is when I said that Scout's mother's voice sounded more like an impression or something like that, that happens directly after he eats the pill. Now, see, this really... this interests me simply just because it doesn't really make much sense at first unless it's that the pill takes immediate effect, and that could possibly be it, because it's I think it's advertised as this medication that really helps you like pretty quickly, so it would make sense why this thing would just automatically fix you or entrance you and like get in your system really fast. And so that could make sense as to why Scout's mother's voice seems more like an impression right after he eats it, like right after he eats the pill, showing that perhaps the pill gives you a realistic sense of security, I guess, where if you don't eat it, it does, like, it shows like what's technically happening, but it's like a more realistic and false sense of security. So I'm guessing that like his mother was already killed and someone was doing the impression, but since Scout was not under the influence, he couldn't tell that or something. Once again, I probably will have to look into the Emesis Blue advertisements and later on in the other chapters to try to figure that piece out, but overall that's my conclusion at the moment. And as I said, I'll explain the chessboard later, but it's weird that there's blue and red chess pieces when Fritz gets knocked to the ground. That might, or not to the ground, when Fritz comes into the house, that might be because it's referencing that Jeremy is pretty much good as dead at this point, I guess. That, like, many clones have suffered from this. Like, many clones and many corpses. That clones have been turned to corpses. That's why there's only one blue pawn left. But then there's more blues, showing there's more clones, which will lead to more red, so it's a chess paradox. And so, that's pretty much all the information, besides Heavy's body being moved, that I have for this chapter. And then, see, that's all the time I'm going to do right now. So, well, I mean, for this video, that's all the time I'm going to be doing right now. But if you're watching the full timeline, you're going to see there's way more time left because that's a compilation. But right now, that's all the time I have here right now for the prologue, chapter 1, chapter 2. And I hope you enjoy chapter 3 and 4 when I make that. I'm Complex to Live. I hope you enjoyed this analysis. I'll see you guys on the other side. Bye-bye.